Hey everyone, in this lecture we'll cover the ancient architecture of Greece and Rome. Greek thinkers created tools that would infinitely change building and working methods. They invented the wheel and axle, the pulley, the inclined plane, the wedge, and the screw. Simple, but effective enough to build the ancient temples and amphitheaters. Ancient Greek architecture is distinguished by its highly formalized characteristics, both of structure and decoration. This is particularly so in the case of temples, where each building appears to have been conceived as a sculptural entity within the landscape, most often raised on high ground, so that the elegance of its proportions and the effects of light on its surfaces might be viewed from all angles. The formal vocabulary of ancient Greek architectural style is divided into three defined orders: the Doric order, the Ionic order, and the Corinthian order. This has a profound effect on Western architecture in later periods. You will learn a lot of important vocabulary today, so make sure to have a notepad nearby. The architecture of ancient Rome grew out of the Greek styles and maintained its influence in Italy unbroken until the present day. From the Renaissance, revivals of classicism have kept alive not only the precise forms and ordered details of Greek architecture, but also its concept of architectural beauty based on balance and proportion. The successive styles of neoclassical architecture and Greek revival architecture followed and adapted ancient Greek styles very closely. If you're on campus, see if you can determine which Greek order was used in the design of Maxey Hall after this lecture. The other thing that I'm curious if you might know is that we often see the pristine white ruins in pictures of Greece, and it's what we picture in our minds, but it's pretty misleading. The Greeks actually painted these structures in many strong colors, and there's actually traces of the paint remaining on the stones. Let's get started with all this vocabulary. So the Greek orders of architecture are a systematic means of organizing elements according to a carefully integrated plan. The first order is the Doric order. It's the oldest and most simplified, and it's known as a masculine order. The columns of this style have a capital top, or the crown of the capital, made of a circular stone called the echinus, with a square block above called the abacus. The shaft, which is the tall part of the column, is plain and it has 20 sides. There is no base to the Doric order. The shaft simply raises from a three-stepped platform called the stylobate. A band of lintels called an entablature is placed above the columns, and it's made of three parts. There's a plain architrave and then a frieze made up of alternating panels. The metopes are plain, and then with a smooth stone section between what is called triglyphs, which are tri meaning three, glyphs meaning these vertical markings. Sometimes the metopes had statues of heroes or gods on them. Again, the metope is the plain part. The triglyphs, as I said, are a pattern of three vertical lines between the metopes. Above this section is a third band of the entablature called the cornice, or the crowning element. In the Doric order, this is slanted like a gable roof. The most famous example of Doric buildings is the Parthenon in Athens, shown in the slide. You'll be learning a lot more about this for your media response. The second order is the Ionic order. It's known as the feminine order. It differs from Doric by having a base that looks like a set of stacked rings, and the shafts are taller than the Doric ones, making the columns look more slender and more feminine. The columns also have flutes, which are lines carved into them from top to bottom. The shafts of the column also had a special characteristic. It's called entasis, which is sort of a little bulge in the columns, making the columns actually look straight, even at a distance. Essentially, it serves to correct this optical or perspective distortion that humans would see the building from very far away, where perfectly straight lines would start looking like they were caving in on each other. Ionic capitals consist of a scroll above the shaft. It looks sort of like ram's horns and it has a name. It's called a volute. It's the piece that's shaped like this, again, sort of like a ram's horn. Above that, you see another abacus. And then the architrave and frieze on the Ionic order is plain with the Ionic style, and the cornice again is slanted like a gable roof. So here, the example is the Temple of Athena Nike in Athens. It's shown in the slide as one of the most famous Ionic buildings in the world. It's actually also located on the Acropolis, very close to the Parthenon. The Corinthian order is the most decorative. Corinthian also uses the entasis, the bulge in the middle of the columns, to make the shafts of the columns look straight. The Corinthian capitals have carved forms of acanthus leaves below a small scroll. So you have these sort of acanthus leaves coming out of the capital, and then a tinier version of that scroll at the top. The shaft has flutes, and the base is like the Ionic. Unlike the Doric and Ionic cornices, which are at a slant, the Corinthian roofs are flat, so there's no triangulated pediment. The Temple of Cybele in Rome is a good example of the Corinthian order. It's shown in the slide. The Romans used the Corinthian order much more than the Greeks, so we'll see a lot more of that coming from the Roman architecture when we get to it. I'll go through a number of other decorative elements now. The first one is one of my favorites. It's called a caryatid. These are human figures. They're usually female. They function as a pier or sort of a column supporting an entablature. On the left here, you see an example of the egg and dart pattern. This is a decorative molding carved with a series of rounded ovals and then arrowheads. On the right, you see an example of the Greek fret pattern. It's an ornamental design consisting of repeated and symmetrical figures, often in relief, contained within a band or a border. Some historians feel that the Greek fret, also called the Greek key, has its basis in the Greek myth of the labyrinth that imprisoned the Minotaur. Rosettes are a common rose-shaped adornment that you see here in the picture in the slide. Festoons are another vocabulary term for a decorative element that is a string or garland of ribbons, flowers, or fruit, or some foliage that's draped between two supports. So you often see these swags carved into the stone, and that is called a festoon. Dentils are a small rectangular block. It has that name because it's kind of like a tooth-like cube. It's used in a series forming a molding, often under Ionic and Corinthian cornices in that long entablature. Another linear pattern is the scroll, a classical frieze ornament that has a spiral form that sort of resembles either a loosely rolled parchment, or I like to think of it as looking like waves. The acanthus leaf was a very popular decorative element, like we saw in the Corinthian column capitals. It is a common plant of the Mediterranean, much like the Egyptians used the papyrus plant as a popular decorative element in their designs. The pilaster is a shallow rectangular column projecting only slightly from the wall, whereas a whole column you would see standing out away from the wall supporting a ceiling or a horizontal plane. The pilaster is purely decorative. In classical architecture, it still conforms to one of the orders. So if you would see a pilaster on a Doric style building, the pilaster would be of the Doric order. But here you can notice a couple of other decorative details. The egg and dart molding we see at the top, and you also see rosettes on the pilaster. Most homes in ancient Greece were typically arranged as a group of rooms surrounding an open courtyard. Residential construction was mostly done in wood as opposed to the grand stonework of the temples and government buildings like we were just looking at. Floor treatments varied by class. Compacted earth was used by all economic levels, but wealthier homeowners used plaster and painting on the walls, and mosaics often defined the floor spaces. Walls for private houses were typically made of sun-dried mud brick, and it would go over a foundation of rubble. So due to the really low compressive strength of the unfired brick walls, the walls were quite thick. We don't actually have fired brick invented until the Roman times. The interior surfaces of these walls were often untreated by the lower classes. It was common, though, for wealthier citizens to have plastering and painting depending on the importance of the room. Lighting was often set into wall niches for candle holders. Here we see a fresco of dolphins. This is from the excavations at the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete. You can notice a couple of other things we've already talked about, like the scroll pattern motif. It's really symbolic for the seafaring people, and you also see their very typical white and blue color scheme. This is also an image from Knossos. This is the bull jumping fresco. And again, we have art of the Minoan people who lived on the island of Crete. So no Greek furniture has actually survived, but the sculptural reliefs and vase paintings are the best sources that we have documenting what Greek furniture was like. Written texts also help us to identify these things. So for example, the splayed legs that curve outward. They're narrow at their floor and wider where the legs join the seat. The seats were square and made of interwoven leather cords. Stools were similar to those that we saw in Egypt, like the folding X stool. Beds in ancient Greece are called a kline, K-L-I-N-E. It had multiple functions. It was a sofa and it was a bed, as well as it was also used for reclining at meals. It was designed with a headboard. The bed surface was constructed of interwoven vegetable fibers or leather. For tables, we see small, portable, and light tables. They're more commonly used by the Greeks than the Egyptians. Tables were used at mealtime when individual tables were brought to the dining room laden with food for the diners who reclined on their clines to eat. The round table pictured above is supported by 3 carved animal legs. Sometimes they were deer legs with terminating hooves as seen in this table, which then transforms into the heads of swans. So why would they use 3 legs? 3 legs are more stable on uneven floor surfaces than 4. Also, just take a quick look and notice the feet. The Greeks didn't attempt to place the legs in a directional position at all, like we saw with the ancient Egyptians. Moving on to ancient Rome. 2 groups were instrumental in shaping the arts of the Romans. The Etruscans came from Asia Minor and brought influences from the Orient. And the Greeks, seafaring people, settled in Sicily and along the coast of southern Italy. In the 1st century BC, the Roman architect and engineer Vitruvius produced a famous treatise, De Architectura, in which he laid out a succinct formula for the virtues that every good building should possess: firmitas, utilitas, and venustas were his trio of essentials. It means strength, function, and delight or beauty. Strength meant a building should stand firm. Function meant it should serve the purpose for which it was built. And delight needs really no further explanation. A good building, whether it's a church or a post office, should give pleasure to the eye and spirit. Most engineering advances depend on either new materials or innovations in structural design or working methods. It was only because the Romans perfected concrete, a mixture of volcanic material like pumice or volcanic ash, with quicklime and aggregate, such as sand or gravel. that they were able to produce the vast domes and arches that characterized their entire empire. The Pantheon in Rome was built by the Emperor Hadrian. It actually replaced the Pantheon of 27 BCE that burned down in 80 CE. It is the only sizable example of Roman classical architecture to survive intact into modern times, while other great structures were pillaged for their materials or simply left to decay. The Pantheon began its life as a temple devoted to all Roman gods. In Latin, pan means all, and theon means gods. It had the good fortune of being consecrated as a church in the 7th century, which assured it a degree of essential maintenance, so it stood till this day. The main outside feature on the front facade is the portico. A portico is a structure consisting of a roof supported by columns at regular intervals, and it's typically attached as a porch to a building. The Pantheon's magnificent masonry dome is 142 feet in diameter. It remains to this day the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. Its fundamental material is concrete, that essential Roman invention, and it's poured between layers of brick and faced on the interior with marble. To keep the dome's weight to a manageable 5,000 tons, in the upper portion, the concrete is often mixed with lighter aggregates like pumice and even empty jars. To further reduce the load, the interior of the dome is cut with a vivid pattern of recessed coffers. Those are the recessed squares that you see in the ceiling, called coffers. They are also bigger at the bottom, with a width of about 20 feet, and as you get closer to the top of the dome, they narrow to about 4 feet. That's where you find the Pantheon's most audacious feature, the oculus. It's a 30-foot wide circular opening through which light descends, depositing itself as a pool of light that moves slowly across the patterned marble floor as the sun makes its daily transit. When it rains through it. When it snows through it. It's really quite amazing. It's a simple but strangely powerful disc. It's the ultimate window to infinity and an eye to the sky. The dome's interior was originally covered in bronze plates that reflected beams of sunlight. Another major Roman structure is the Colosseum. The Colosseum was built as an amphitheater by Emperor Vespasian for the people of Rome. Games and shows lasting 100 days celebrated the opening of the Colosseum in 80 CE. The theater was used for gladiator competitions, mock sea battles, reenactments of famous battles, dramas based on classical mythology, animal hunts, and executions. 50,000 to 80,000 spectators could be seated in the Colosseum. An earthquake damaged a large part of the Colosseum, but the limestone structure you see here today was covered in marble. The facade is made up of repeating Roman arches. Roman arches are semicircular in form and are used to span wide openings where just a single straight stone lintel could not span. The Roman arch is made up of many small wedge-shaped stones put together so that each stone of resur is held trapped between the neighbors on either side. A series of successive arches like these, when you have multiple Roman arches strung together, is called an arcade. The interior of the Colosseum is like a stadium today. Unlike a football field, though, the design of the arena floor is oval. This is intentional to keep the action moving in an event like a gladiator battle. So there's no corner that you could get backed into, making for like a really quick show. In this image, you're seeing the passageways below the arena floor. This is called the hypogeum, where gladiators and wild animals were held until their spectacle. These walls were built after they decided not to flood for mock sea battles anymore. The Vatican declared the Colosseum sacred in memory of Christians that were martyred here. This no doubt played a role in why the building is still standing, but the arena did later serve as a quarry for materials looted to build Renaissance churches and palaces, including St. Peter's Basilica. To help protect spectators from the brutal Roman sun during events, a velarium was used. It is an ingenious system of sail like awnings rigged on ropes to protect the audience from sun and rain. Many have tried to understand how it was mounted and operated. This is a visualization of what it may have looked like. It is believed the rigging would have taken a team of about 1,000 men to install. The Roman streets. This is a picture of a street in a residential quarter of Pompeii. The outside of the houses were often left plain with no lawns or gardens facing the street. Only the occasional balcony or public fountain or bar breaks the monotony. This is because the homes are designed around inner central atriums and courtyards. So this is one of those bars that I mentioned that might break up the monotony. This is a typical fast food counter, or thermopolium. The wells set into the counters would have held soup, stew, or wine. Most residents of Pompeii lived in single rooms without cooking facilities, and so most of their meals would have been from establishments like this one. Wealthier residents had much more space. Here we see an atrium at the house of the Veti in Pompeii. The atrium has a central pool open to the sky. The best examples of Roman homes come from the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. This is because Mount Vesuvius, a volcano, erupted in 79 AD and buried these cities in lava. So the lava preserved all of the artifacts in air and light-tight chambers, much like that of the Egyptian pyramids. We have been able to excavate so much of these incredibly well-preserved interiors, down to the vibrantly painted frescoes on the walls and intricately tiled mosaics on the floors. Floors were typically decorated with mosaics in wealthy houses, especially in the public rooms such as the atriums. This sort of 3D cube design is a common pattern. Beautiful effects were produced by combining marbles of different tints. The Romans ransacked the world for striking stone colors. Here we see another atrium with Roman doorways, which, like our own, had 4 parts: the threshold you walk over, 2 jambs on either vertical side, and the lintel above the opening. The lintel was always a single piece of stone or wood, and oddly massive. The doors were exactly like those of modern times, except in the use of hinges. Romans had hinges like ours, but they didn't use them on their doors. The door support was a cylinder of hardwood and a little longer than the door, and of a diameter greater than the thickness of the door, terminating above and below in pivots. So these pivots turned in sockets on the threshold and lintel. Let's take a look at some of their furnishings. The lectus was a kind of all-purpose piece of furniture like the Greek klein, used for sleeping, sitting, relaxing, or eating. It has a wooden frame supporting crisscross leather straps that held a mattress stuffed with wool or feathers. It had a headboard, or sometimes as pictured here, a head and a footboard. The legs were highly decorated and inlaid with bronze or other metals. The Romans had chairs and stools modeled after Greek versions we have seen. A special form of the stool called the sella was the sella caeruleus. It was a seat of honor and a symbol of legal authority. It was used by high magistrates or by the emperor. The major characteristic is the double recessed curved base that is able to fold with the cloth seat. It's even shown on the ancient Roman coin. Again, we see variations on Greek furnishings with tables as well, such as this small marble tripod table in the garden of the House of Stags from the 3rd century BC. So that concludes our quick tour of ancient Greek and ancient Roman architecture and interiors. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.